I know Lucian is nearby, so we're going to go ahead and get started, and I suspect he will walk in partway through. So welcome to the last panel of the day, one that is titled Shareholder Franchise Under Pressure. It is motivated, if Kathy Huang's still out there. No, Kathy, it's not motivated by the memorable eponymous title from David Bowie and Queen from 1982, but from a simple observation that the shareholder voting franchise in public companies has come to occupy a significant and somewhat freighted position amongst investors, courts, regulators, and commentators in recent years. And not only have things like the poison pill channeled control contest away from tender offers and towards the ballot box, but in a bunch of other areas, there have been sort of growing waves of economic and social activism that have contributed similarly to the growing centrality and focus on shareholder voting, and in turn, the more dispositive role that shareholder voting is playing in a bunch of these contexts. We've also seen a magnified focus on how the shareholder franchise itself operates. And from there, it's not a lot of work to predict the centrality of proxy advisors, institutional investors, and even the long ignored retail shareholder. So a genuine sort of an almost weaponized tug of war over the shareholder voting franchise is clearly underway. And to talk about it, we are excited to welcome an amazing group of panelists to explore some of the most critical aspects of this tug of war. Oops, I'll get that later. Thanks a lot, Jeff. So I'll go from my right to left. Erik Gerding on the far right is the capital markets partner at Freshfields, where he advises clients on cutting-edge issues in securities regulation, financial markets, and corporate governance. Many of you know Erik. Not only was he on the faculty of the University of Colorado, but until the end of 2024, he served as the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission's Director of the Division of Corporation Finance. To his left is Jeff Mahoney, the General Counsel for the Council of Institutional Investors, where his responsibilities include advocating for the Council's membership-approved policies before standard setters, regulators, members of Congress, and other policymakers. To my left is Scott Grinsell, the global co-head of engagement at Elliott Investment Management, where he focuses on the firm's activism in M&A situations globally and has worked on many of the firm's largest public and private investments since joining the firm in 2017. He's a recovering corporate lawyer from Wachtell as well. To his left is Jill Fisch, the Saul Fox Distinguished Professor of Business Law at University of as a good slip, though. My dean would approve of that slip. At the University of Pennsylvania's Carey School of Law, many of you know Jill. She's an incredibly prolific and insightful commentator and academic contributor in corporate law and governance. And finally, to her left is another significant contributor in corporate law, Lucian Bedchuk, who is the James Barr Ames Professor of Law, Economics, and Finance, and Director of the Program on Corporate Governance at Harvard Law School. So I want to thank all of you for being here to be part of this panel. Bill Savitt from Wachtell was supposed to be here, and evidently Elon Musk and Altman are having some form of kerfuffle, I guess, and he's got a hearing that he's got to be at. So sorry that Bill could not make it. Now, by mutual agreement, and in the hopes of catalyzing discussion over droning, this panel has agreed that what we're going to do is adhere to sort of a table topics view of how we go through some of these issues. So I am going to direct a series of, I guess, topics or subtopics to the panel, asking initially one speaker to spend a few minutes giving a broad overview and initial thoughts, and then inviting other panelists to engage, disagree, contribute, and so forth, their perspectives in a substantive back and forth. After about 10 minutes, I am going to careen wildly into the next topic. All right, so I guess my job, my enviable job, is to keep this group of really smart, really talkative people on schedule, so you guys can be released into the afternoon. All right, so I want to start with Erik, who's all the way to my right, your left here, and I want to talk a little bit about the about the securities law implications of activism and the shareholder voting franchise. So, as you know, most of the governance showdowns that we see today, if we set like Warner Brothers bidding wars aside, happen through the ballot box and the proxy voting system. And here, there's been a lot of discussion about the securities law reporting requirements under Schedule 13D. And the 2023 SEC amendments to beneficial owner standards, which were followed up again by guidance more recently, were meant to modernize transparency associated with those filing requirements. And while there were some mechanical improvements, the amendments still left a lot to interpretive approaches. So where should the line be drawn between legitimate shareholder engagement and conduct meant to influence control? How should group formation interact with informal coordination or the use of advisors? Will we ever have a clear answer to the question of whether cash-settled total return swaps constitute beneficial ownership? Give us a broad overview, and then I'll have others chime in.
So thank you for having me, Erik. I will note on a corporate governance level, it's really interesting, the move you just pulled on the Columbia Law faculty to try to hire somebody from the podium. Nice corporate governance here at Columbia Law School.
Well, yeah, it was a lightning strike to the extent I could pull it off. All right.
So I think I thought a lot about what I wanted to say today, and I think the basic message is going to be, we saw a lot of movement under the current SEC leadership in the last year on corporate governance. And we're going to talk about a series of things. I'll talk about 13DG to begin with, and then we'll move on to shareholder proxies and mirror voting and other matters. And the direction of travel is pretty clear. It's pretty clear that this SEC leadership is looking to rebalance the relationship between management and shareholders. And there's been a lot of developments, particularly outside of notice and comment rulemaking in the last year. But I think the overall reaction that I started to have last year, that this is a pretty profound shift in corporate governance, might be very premature for a couple of reasons that I'll talk about. So I think the one message that I think that we ought to get is to take a deep breath about what the SEC has done over the last year and what is likely to be the lasting consequences. So we'll talk about 13DG as an example. But I think the basic structure of what I'll talk about could apply to a lot of the other subsequent developments that we'll talk about. So you're right, like we did while I was at the SEC, we did pass new 13DG beneficial ownership reporting rules. And there were, as there always are with new rules, interpretive questions in terms of how that works. What we saw in February of last year was my former staff issue some compliance and disclosure interpretations on 13DG, and the real splashy part of those compliance and disclosure interpretations were about broadening what was meant by attempting to influence management. And the reason that this matters is that shareholders don't want necessarily to cross the line between being a passive investor and having to file a 13G for their beneficial ownership and going to a more active stance and having to file a 13D. So broadening the interpretation of who is attempting to influence management would cause more investors to go from a 13G filing to a 13D filing. And this was caused a lot of consternation. It caused a lot of discussion in the corporate bar, among shareholders, and among public companies. And the initial reaction, stage one, was this is going to be a very, very big deal. It was accompanied by a speech by the acting chair of the SEC at the time, Marc, that really focused on how the CDIs were aimed at ESG investors, placing pressure on management, and that this was attempting to redraw the line so that activist investors wouldn't be able to hold management hostage, quote unquote hostage, without having to file a 13D. So the initial reaction was very broad, and the initial reaction was, despite the chair's speech, if you look at the CDIs, they are not limited to ESG investors or ESG activists at all. They have a much broader potential scope. So then we actually saw how, stage two, we saw how companies were actually reacting to these new CDIs, how shareholders were reacting. And this is, I think, a law of unintended consequences, particularly for policymakers, because institutional shareholders of all stripes, I think, looked at the CDIs and came to the same conclusion that I just did, that these are not limited to ESG investors. They are much more broadly applicable. And if they're more broadly applicable, what we saw was in the opening weeks, many institutional shareholders, including the largest asset managers, were extremely skittish of having any kind of conversation, even a run-of-the-mill conversation, with management. That was clearly, I think, not what was intended by the CDIs or what the staff or the SEC leadership intended. And it wasn't necessarily good for public companies either. We had a number of clients who were very frustrated because meetings with institutional shareholders were either not happening or were turning into staring matches where institutional shareholders were not able to say what was on their mind. Stage three, though, I think then happened where a number of institutional shareholders, starting with the largest asset managers, began to adapt their practices. So I think you saw some asset managers would open meetings with a disclosure or a disclaimer about what their intent was. And they learned to talk about what they wanted out of the meeting in a careful way in terms of talking about their overall policies and past voting in order to not come close to even the newly clarified line. So I think what you're seeing here is that you're not necessarily seeing the intended consequences of what the SEC leadership thinks is going to happen actually happen. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that in the 14A8 season. You look like you're about to say something.
Me?
Yeah.
I am. Okay.
Yeah. You're not necessarily going to, policies don't necessarily work the way you think they will, and we're going to see that in the current 14A8 season, which I think Jill is going to talk about. But B, I think you're also going to see adaptation, which I think we also see in a number of other fields that other speakers will talk about. What's the last stage? Well, the last stage is the future. And this goes back to the way in which the SEC leadership is trying to accomplish a lot of these policy shifts. They're doing it outside of notice and comment rulemaking. They're doing that for a reason. Notice and comment rulemaking is slow. It means you've got to gather comments, you've got to have a reasoned response to comments, and it's final agency action, which means it's subject to Administrative Procedure Act litigation. Acting through guidance or acting through internal governance rules, like the SEC did with the mandatory arbitration moves, means that you can avoid all of that. But the downside is that there is a big question mark that we are getting from lots of clients about how sticky or how long-lasting are these changes. Can the next administration come in and fairly easily reverse guidance internal corporate governance changes, speeches, no action letters. And I think that's a very, very good question. It's also something that I think you will see, for example, in the CDIs yesterday, that I'm not sure what we have time to talk about, but the new tender offer. I'm sorry, it's not CDI, it's the new exemptive order for tender offers. Like, that's another approach that doesn't require notice and comment rulemaking. But I think there's a big question mark in terms of how long lasting those changes will be.
So Scott, let me pull you into this because you at least spend some of your day job thinking about whether you might marginally be trying to influence management. So these various stages, you're kind of living through the stages of adaptation or grief or whatever Erik was talking about. Give me your kind of sense about how you guys are thinking about these issues.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think I agree with a lot of what you said, Erik. I think so. We have a comment letter in with which we submitted in September to the SEC on this issue, and when we described some of our experience in that letter, I think I agree with. I forget the exact stages, but all but the last stage. So I think the response of the institutional investors in my firsthand experience in meetings with companies, as we outlined in the letter, has been that they had the sort of response you described. I think they do begin with the disclaimer. I think the conversations, however, remain, even in this year, notably different than they were, prior to the guidance. I think that the openness of those conversations is quite different. I don't think that there is yet clarity for a lot of managers about what this guidance means, and you can understand why, as a member of the investing team of one of these large institutions, you come out of that meeting with Elliott. And you have to explain what happened in the meeting. There's a lot of concern about what disclosure obligations might follow from that discussion. And I think in the guidance itself, the word pressure is doing a lot of work. I think the SEC could do something to clarify that and to make clear that certain kinds of discussion, especially as it relates to our situations, but also contested M&A, that talking about potential director nominees and even going so far as to say how you might consider voting in a proxy contest are important for two reasons. One is that they help to facilitate settlements, which is a good thing. It's very helpful for the activist and for the company to know where everybody stands and I think it's also important because it encourages discussion. So it helps get you a better resolution. It ensures that there's a better flow of ideas across the market. So, I think just to finish, I think we still have some concern that without a written guidance from the SEC that clarifies this, that this confusion will persist for some time.
Now, Jill, you spent a lot of time thinking about stockholder voting, and do you sort of the situation as Erik describes is still in a little bit of a state of flux, and how are we going to adapt in the future? Thoughts?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of spillover, and Scott's sort of gotten us a little bit down that path, right? And so one thing I worry about is this concept of influencing management, right? That's not limited to the 13D, 13G context, sorry. That's obviously related to proxy solicitation, shareholder voting, collective action in that forum. And, we saw that with Attorney General's Paxton's litigation against the big three, right? Influencing management, cutting down on Texas's oil and gas business, right? So, is this limited to, the M&A context? Clearly not. Does whatever interpretation that's in there influence whether you should be considered a group when you're discussing voting on, a director election or a shareholder proposal? I think it clearly does. And just one more thing I want to flag so that this is an active discussion. There's a lot of discussion, particularly in response to Chair Atkins' talk at Delaware last fall, about private ordering replacing the shareholder voting and the shareholder proposal process, right? One component of that is likely to be a greater move towards minimum ownership requirements. Well, when you talk to other investors about satisfying the minimum ownership requirement, have you started down that path in which not only is this potentially a proxy solicitation, but could you be considered a group? And then do you have to worry about all of the holdings, putting aside the cash settled, right? Everybody else's holdings to figure if you're over the 5%, right? So that's really scary.
Lucian, you're itching to get in.
Yes. I share Jill's view, but I'll say it maybe a bit more strongly. So I view the step of the SEC as unfortunate, and that's because they are pushing things exactly in the wrong direction. And what they are doing is they are broadening the concept of influencing management so that almost anything in which shareholders express a clear preference as to whether the company should do X or should do Y, that's already under influencing control. I think, and that's something that in our work or index funds we stress, if anything, we have a problem that the big three and Fidelity might be not sufficiently active and arguably too differential to issuers. So if anything, we would like to encourage them to use their shareholder rights, and having shareholders express what they want and nudging the company in this direction is a good thing, not a bad thing. Now, I had a commissioner in my class last fall, and the students were expressing similar sentiments. And what he said was, we are not chilling anything, we just want them to disclose. So, you know, they should just file 13D, and, you know, and that's all. But this is naive, and the reason why it's naive is in the same work or index funds, we documented that none of the big three has ever in the last 15 years filed a 13D, nor did Fidelity, nor did any other large asset manager. And the reason is that it's just prohibitively costly for them. So therefore, it's naive for the SEC to say, we are okay if they are signaling to the board how they should go. They should just file technically 13D. We know that they're not going to do that. And the implication of this is that the SEC is pushing them in the direction of further passivity and greater deference to the board, which I submit is the wrong direction.
Yeah, we're going to come back a little bit to some of these pressure points, including pass-through voting, mirror voting, and so forth, that have definitely affected institutional investors. Jeff, I want to pivot to you. Erik and I think Jill both mentioned stockholder proposals. The CII actually has put out a letter on 14A8. As you know well, the SEC took a posture not too long ago saying, at least temporarily, we're going to take sort of a hands-off approach of doing no action letter review of refusals to, of rejections of shareholder proposals under 14A8I. You know, your letter is critical of the CII letter is critical of it. One of the things that I've always wondered about it is that, you know, when you teach the shareholder proposal process and a no action letter comes out of the SEC, that can actually help you as an issuer if you get brought in for, you know, for freezing out a legitimate shareholder proposal. Say, look, I've got the seal of approval of this NAL. It's not precedential, but it does help. Yes. And so one could imagine that this kind of scaling back by the SEC could go in either direction, in either freezing or actually maybe encouraging more shareholder proposals. Why did the CII come down the way it did?
Yeah, I think historically our membership have looked at the SEC staff's use of the no action process and been pretty pleased with it overall. I mean, it ebbs and flows depending upon who the SEC chair is, but overall, our members have been quite satisfied with having the SEC staff as the arbiter of these no actions, even if in some cases they disagree with it. So now we're kind of in an unknown without the SEC staff involved. So would a litigation courts taking this up rather than the SEC staff, would that be more efficient, effective, favorable to our members? I think most of our members think not. So that was kind of the basis behind our letter, that historically we've been pretty pleased, though we've had some issues here and there, we've been pretty pleased with the SEC, and we just think the SEC is going to do a more effective and efficient job than a court would.
And another letter that the CIA put forward has to do with something Jill mentioned and the last panel, you know, talked a lot about in the morning, was arbitration, right? Chair Atkins has come out of the box hot, saying that arbitration provisions should be much more welcome in the securities context, has encouraged Delaware to revisit its own statutory restrictions, even though Dorothy and I think they already might have done so. You know, and your letter also was critical of the mandatory arbitration issue. What are some of the stakes involved in the arbitration thing? And I'll just give you a little anecdote. Dorothy and I were having lunch with some defense side securities attorneys and asking about mandatory arbitration. They actually were not huge fans. They said, look, you know, what would happen in an ordinary course is you do get this stay on discovery pending a motion to dismiss. You're not necessarily going to get that in an arbitration setting.
I've heard some of the same things. I'm less worried about this one than on shareholder proposals. I mean, our policy includes a provision that indicates that companies should not attempt to bar share owners from the courts through the introduction of forced arbitration clauses. So that's our membership approved policy. So based on that policy, we have concerns. But since I wrote that letter, I've heard some of probably the same conversations you have, that lawyers representing corporations are telling their corporations, no, you don't want to go there, because the experience is through mass arbitration in consumer claims. And they're saying if we get that instead of class actions, you're going to be defending cases all over the country, and the amount of resources that the company is going to have to use to defend those claims, you're better off sticking with class actions. So that's what I'm hearing. So I don't know if that's the way most people feel, but I'm less concerned about this one, because I think a lot of corporate lawyers are already pushing on the other side of this.
Jill, you had chimed in earlier about arbitration. I wonder if you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, so it's funny, I mean, Jeff's example, I think, is one more illustration of what Erik initially said, right? You know, the SEC doesn't necessarily anticipate how these things are going to go. I think that's true for arbitration. I think that's true for getting rid of Rule 14A8, which is obviously on the table, right? And, you know, just the staff guidance alone, I think the SEC staff, or the SEC, assumed we're going to stop providing these no action letters, and this is going to cut down on shareholder proposals, because nobody's going to go to court and try and force an issuer to include one of these. And surprise, surprise, there were a lot of shareholders out there, right? A lot of members of
Two of our members.
Yeah, who were like, you know, no, we're gonna sue. And when companies realized, okay, we could be litigating this as opposed to getting this comforting letter from the SEC, they backed down. With respect to shareholder proposals themselves, right? What does the world look like where there are no shareholder proposals? Are we going to see more no votes on, say, on pay? Are we going to see more no votes on directors? Are we going to see things that kind of cause the company a lot more pain than this, you know, 1% of the shareholders voting in favor of this climate transition policy?
You know, we warned the SEC in our letter and in person that, you know, two things are going to happen. At least the first one, it already appears we're right, that there's going to be more litigation. But the second one is the one you touched on, that we're hearing a lot of chatter as well. There's going to be vote no campaigns. They're going to keep track of who's omitting these proposals, and they're going to use that as a new basis to launch a no vote campaign. And some are talking about voting against the governance committee members, governance committee chair. So that talk is going on right now, and I'm sure some are going to pull the trigger on it. Not sure how many, but we'll find out soon.
So this is a great entree into our next table topic, which is effectively the mechanics and possibly manipulation of how the shareholder franchise works itself. Professor Lund and I have been working on some research that kind of tries to bring the shareholder voting franchise kind of into, all fours with what we know from 8 decades of political science literature on how well voting does or does not work to aggregate preferences. And the short answer is that it's complicated. It sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, and under very restrictive situations it can work well. Other ways it's possible to blow it up. And there is right now a kind of a fascinating debate, Scott, on how what had long been basically the ignored rational abstention voters, largely in retail, and efforts to sort of coax them out of the bushes in a bunch of different ways. The most notable example is ExxonMobil's plan for standing voting instructions that was rolled out last year, where retail investors could authorize what is essentially standing instructions to permit ExxonMobil to vote their shares along management recommendations. And it's kind of interesting about that because while I believe ExxonMobil did get a no action letter, one could imagine just reversing the polarity on this, right, and having an activist get standing instructions from shareholders to vote, and the New York City comptroller, had sort of rolled out a proposal that's more like along the lines of a vote no campaign, but it had some similar vibes to it. Now, it's not clear that when an issuer does this, as opposed to when an activist or an outside group does it, they're going to be completely on all fours with one another. But that's just one issue. You were also kind of contending with, with this recent encouragement of pass-through voting to retail stockholders, do you have to kind of get inside what the retail stockholder is thinking, make pitches in that direction? For mirrored voting, how does that sort of enter into the mix? And there are a lot of different pieces that are being put together all at the same time. How are you guys sort of processing what to think about, like the ensuing kind of, settling out, the Erik Gerding kind of equilibrium is going to be in this context?
So I think that it's helpful to start with Exxon because it was an important development that got a lot of attention last year, and I think highlights conceptually an important issue kind of at the heart of all these different debates that you've referenced that are sort of going on in the governance community. So, I think on Exxon, it seems to be just, as you noted, just for the group's sort of benefit, it is this notion that, a company can introduce an ability of retail shareholders to opt into a default rule, basically, that they can have their votes cast in support of management, or it has a second option that that they can exclude contested M&A and proxy fights from that instruction. So there's sort of two options. But it's at its core, it's a strong default, and I think that basically this idea of locking in kind of a dead hand vote for management is inherently problematic, and is not something that is a good thing for shareholder democracy or for corporate governance generally. And you can sort of it is possible to disagree about how things might work for contested M&A and proxy fights, but the notion that some percentage of the shares could be locked in, in all circumstances, seems clearly wrong and quite problematic. I think when you look at this whole area, I think from a practitioner's perspective, the goal, and this goes to kind of how we live these situations, the means we have with institutional investors, our communications materials, so the way we kind of craft our arguments. This is all about fostering a debate, right? And we want that debate to be, I think we should, it's important for corporate governance that that debate be, robust and nuanced. And when a certain percentage of the vote is locked in some manner, that is not supportive of that objective. So, I think at the end of the day, we should not predetermine outcomes in the elections. They should be the result of a careful, deliberative process. So, I think there's also been, as you know, Erik, an effort by certain of the index funds to introduce pass-through voting. There's also a very important development. I think within that effort, I think the efforts of certain of the index funds, especially Vanguard, to bring in other stakeholders into those conversations are really to be applauded and are notable, because that kind of, these are big changes in the system, and including a variety of perspectives in those conversations is important. I think, but there too, I think as we look through at pass-through, there are a number of important questions we need to consider. One is, that it may increase the costs of these programs, because in general, investors buy ETFs because they're a lower cost product. The administration of these programs is more expensive. And there's also a question of what the default should be when people don't opt in. We know that retail shareholders are hard to access. They're despite the vast resources that we spend in our campaigns to access them, they generally do not vote, and that's been well documented in research by Jill and others over the years. So, the question of how you get there is hard, but I think at the end of the day, the default within pass-through is probably one of the toughest questions, and it should also not be a dead hand. It needs to be something kind of that encourages this debate. And within that context, the question of the potential role of a mere voting approach is intriguing. I think that approach potentially is it could help facilitate the dialogue rather than lock in a certain percentage of the shares. And so look, I'll just conclude by saying, I think as we look at the different options, I think the key question is really kind of what approach will create the greatest level of accountability in public companies. That's kind of the governance objective of all of these. And when we invest all over the world, we do a lot in Europe as well. There's a qualitative difference the way we experience engagement with European companies where a large percentage of the shares is locked up in a foundation or is controlled by a family. And that affects the behavior of the other shareholders and the overall market conditions, and I think ultimately makes us less attractive for investors. So, I think, and just to tie it back to the 13G question, the fragility of this whole system, that is really, to Erik's point about, the response of the institutional investors to that one piece of guidance, all of this is very fragile. And so I think, the objective should be for regulation to support the conversations that exist, not kind of diminish them. So I'll stop there and let others respond to that.
That's super interesting. It actually starts to border on what our next topic is, so I can maybe mush them together. No, it's perfect. That's why I set it up in this order. So there is sort of this question, Jill. I'm going to direct this towards you. This idea of what should shareholders be voting on? What should retail shareholders be voting on? And let me preface this with some kind of devil's advocate sort of points, right? Shareholder voting is a type of preference aggregation mechanism, right? And if done well, you get a great read, not only on what people like and don't like, but also they may be busy collecting information that will help inform the overall debate. So there are these kind of two things. You kind of want people to, basically form an opinion, maybe spend a little time doing it, and then express it through something, and the shareholder vote is, at the ballot box. There are some things that's going to miss, right? It's going to miss intensity of preferences, right? If the 5 of you split 3-2, but these 2 are going to lose like crazy if your 3 votes are going to get picked, they're still going to lose 3-2, right? And so it's not going to aggregate, differential preferences in terms of intensities. People may free ride off of each other in collecting information. There may be just on mirrored voting, right? It's hard to imagine mirrored voting induces the person whose vote's going to get mirrored to collect information because it's a big, I don't know, just let everyone else do this. So it's almost a type of an institutionalized free riding problem. But then on the other end of the spectrum, like shareholder voting has to matter and it be really, really important in the appropriate domains. But how do we kind of figure this out?
Yeah, so you've put a lot on the table, and let me maybe break this into 2 pieces, right? The first is, what is the, following up on Scott's comments about mechanics, right? To the extent you lock up a bunch of the vote, right, then voting is not going to, putting aside flaws in the way voting works and aggregation of preferences and all of that, right? If a significant number of votes are locked up, right, doesn't really get you there. And, some of the recent developments, I think, are very much in that direction. And I would include what you've called pass-through voting, which isn't really pass-through voting, right? Proxy choice or voting choice programs, right? It's not letting retail investors decide, right? I would include it in that vein. Why? 2 reasons. One, what you are getting to choose is a proxy advisor policy. I keep asking the question, I'm kind of confused, right? I just saw the latest executive order. I just saw the DOL guidance. I thought proxy advisors were really bad and evil, except when they're controlling the votes of the retail investors who don't even know that they hold securities in this company because they've been defaulted into a target date fund in their 401k plan, right? And the fund sponsors are going to be constrained as to what the menu of voting choice programs is because of their fiduciary duties, and you can't really have, I don't even know if the ESG voting policy that Dorothy studies in her paper with Alumbrov, I don't know if that's going to survive, right? But certainly, even if you could choose that program, it wouldn't tell you what's going to happen when you have a vote on reincorporation in Texas or, any of the matters that we think are really important. So that's I set up my pivot point, right? What are the votes that are really important? What should shareholders vote on? And here I just want to throw things out and maybe hear a little bit more discussion from the panel. So we've heard two themes that a lot of the reform efforts are sort of coalescing around. One is this sort of E&S or ESG theme, right? And those things are illegitimate, right? What shareholders should vote on is things that are economically material, not on things that are not, right? Well, I don't know exactly how you decide what's economically material. And I don't know that the fact that we can fit something into an ES or G label answers that question, right? In fact, one of the things that we've seen this proxy season is we've seen a lot of carbon transition policy proposals go away, but we've seen this consistency in these proposals to separate the chair and CEO positions, right? Now, we've all seen the empirical research. You can't really make a sound case that this is economically material, that has an effect on stock price, right? So are those good proposals as opposed to bad proposals? And, you know, to what extent is all of this empirical research firm and context dependent? And at the end of the day, right, the second thing is we are told that the fiduciaries in this space are actually constrained from doing anything unless they can make the empirical case that it materially affects firm economic value. Now, again, I can't imagine any shareholder vote, right, and putting aside ESG, in which I can come up with a sound empirical study. I looked at this when we first saw the reincorporations into Texas and Nevada, and in the context of the Chancery Court's TripAdvisor decision. I don't know that you can prove whether reincorporating into Texas or Nevada is good or bad for firm value, but you certainly can't come up with any confident, yes, I can document an empirical basis. Does that mean a proxy advisor can't vote against reincorporation in Texas? Does that mean Vanguard can't vote against it because they don't have a sound empirical basis for showing it's going to hurt shareholder value? So, you know, I think those questions are really, really tough. And at the end of the day, right, then you say to yourself, well, you know, if we can't figure out the right answer to any of these questions, why are shareholders voting at all, right? And all I can give you is, well, there's two states of the world. We might say, well, directors are fiduciaries, right? You buy into a company because you trust directors and you trust fiduciary duties, right? Why would shareholders ever think they know better? The path that gets you down is, well, no shareholder voting, or maybe no shareholder voting except when there's a merger or something like that, right? The other possibility is, well, you know, accountability matters. Right? And so sure, we can't document, we can't prove with an empirical study when the vote is going to be consequential, but it's not just the vote, it's not just the issue, it's the possibility of this, right? These are the guardrails, right? And I think, you know, if you take the guardrail approach, number one, it frees you from this need to document, yes, this vote is economically significant, right? But it also opens the door to a much broader range of issues.
Lucian, I want to get you to chime in here, and then I'm going to go over to Erik as well. So, you know, we all teach our students in corporate law that shareholders basically have a three-legged stool of rights, right? They have the right to vote, they have the right to sue, and they have the right to sell. And those three legs, on some level, all have to be collectively balancing the corporate governance stool. I think it's a fair thing to say, what like Jeff and Dorothy's paper this morning suggested, like a lot of investment opportunities have been pulled out of the public markets, and there aren't easy possibilities to either buy or sell for retail investors in that space. We've seen a fair amount, SB 21 is really just the most recent example of kind of pulling back in you know, the right to sue under some circumstances. Has that just mechanically placed more emphasis on voting, even if voting has its own flaws, some of which Jill and Scott have been talking about?
How does SB 21 do that?
It makes it harder, for example, it makes it much easier to cleanse a conflict of interest involving a controller for a non-squeeze out.
Yeah, so from my perspective, SB 21 is contracting is contracting in the important subset of companies that have a controlling shareholder, what shareholders can meaningfully vote on, and that's concerning. And I'll make a few points about this, and I should say that those points are based on a paper that Kobe Castillo and I have called Controllers Unbound. It's on SSRN, and anyone who reads it, God bless you.
I've read it.
God bless you.
Thank you very much.
So, as a background, in the paper we start by providing evidence on how much controlling shareholders have become significant in our economy, because many people in the corporate governance universe were thinking about the US as mainly the predominant form of companies that are widely held and no controlling shareholder. But this has been gradually changing over time. At present, on the American exchanges, there are 939 companies with a controller with an aggregate market capitalization of 13.5 trillion. And Delaware law for them is even more central than it is for widely held companies. Companies that are incorporated in Delaware represent 76% of controlled company by number and 92% of the market capitalization of all controlled firms. Now, basically, as you all know, prior to SB 21, we had a trend, we had some line of chancery court cases that expanded the situations in which we will have a majority of the minority votes. And putting aside arguments that some people have made, whether those cases were aberration from the right doctrine or not, I think there were great cases. But from our perspective, we're just looking at the substantive effects of moving from a regime in which there might be MOM votes in many cases to a regime in which post-SB 21 we have MOM votes only in the context of freeze-outs. And let me just make several points as to why we think this is worrisome for investors and they should pay a great deal of attention to it. So first of all, the lack of MOM votes outside freeze-outs is going to enable controllers to get substantial private benefits greater than I think people have recognized in this debate, because in the debate there were many people who were concerned about SB 21 as an institutional matter, that Delaware seemed to be acting under pressure, but people didn't think that this is the end of the world by itself. But we think it's not the end of the world, but significant piece of the world is going to change. And we identify 6 concrete ways in which controllers would be able and should be expected to take advantage of this. One, perhaps very important, is that in the new regime, controllers can generally, whether you start with dual class structure or with just a majority ownership, you can introduce dual class, non-voting shares, distribute them as dividend pro rata. This is what Meta attempted several years ago, but this was blocked because of the prospect of litigation. And as a result of that, the controller will have, let's suppose you distributed a ratio of 10-1, the controller would have 90% of their equity tickets being non-voting shares and 10% being voting shares. The implication of this is that the controller can cash out their equity tickets to the fullest extent they want by just selling non-voting shares and retaining the same lock on voting rights. So you could imagine somebody who right now has 10% of the superior voting shares, have a lock on control but cannot sell any shares because that would dilute their control. With this new move, you can go all the way to 1%. In principle, you could go to 0.5%. You can, in the same way, use non-voting shares whenever you raise capital. So if you think about the paradigmatic way in which US companies became widely held, they initially often had an initial controller or controlling group, but over time, as the controller wanted to liquidate some stuff, or when they wanted to raise capital, their lock on control would weaken or would go away. With this new instrument, it's not going to happen, even if we started with a single class structure. Secondly, controllers would be able to eliminate the sunsets in all public companies, or in almost all public companies that have them. We looked at all the charter provisions of this kind, and the overwhelming majority do not have any protection other than the old protection we had of potentially MOM votes. Third, it's going, we expect, to open the floodgates of compensation, with controllers getting mega pay arrangements that should be expected to be an order of magnitude larger than the pay packages in widely held companies that also have attracted attention from scholars over the years. And there are several other ways, but worthwhile reading the paper.
So,
second point,
go ahead.
yeah,
All right.
I'll try to be brief. The second point is that the curtailing of MOM votes should be expected to transform the ownership patterns in the US. Even now, we have more controlled companies than we used to have, but this is going to change it bigly because, as I just explained, controllers would not need either to raise capital or to cash out some of their equity tickets. They would not need to forgo capital and to forgo control. And the cost of foregoing control, given the increased private benefits, would be larger. And therefore, we should expect that when you come to the next Columbia conference, or not the next one, to a Columbia conference 20 years from now, you'll see that the economy,
Well, none of us are going to be at that one, but.
there are going to be many conferences in between, but the one in 20 years from now, you'll see many more controlled companies and many more controlled companies with what we called small minority controllers. Third, and maybe I'll stop here because Erik is looking at me.
I'm not giving the real side
So
eye.
the elimination of MOM votes, we have a kind of a detailed analysis of the paper, is expected to considerably lower the level of protection to unaffiliated public investors relative to the level of protection in other advanced economies with respect to controlling shareholders. We use the Schleifer and his co-authors anti-self-dealing index, and if you look at their scores, which were also used by the Dykes-Zingales study, we estimate that the changes from the elimination of the MOM votes reduce the score of investor protection in Delaware companies by about 25% to 33%. And using the empirical findings in those papers suggests that this might be associated with a considerable reduction in market value and a significant increase in control premiums. I'm not giving you these numbers to suggest it's hard to extrapolate across countries, but just to indicate that this might be an issue that is worth your attention. Thank you.
Lucian, do you see the rise of controllers being kind of an independent phenomenon from the increased sort of attention that's been given to stockholder voting? or does it predate it? And the reason I'm asking that is incredibly self-serving. So, so Dorothy and I have this paper that basically suggests that, look, there are two things that are really big challenges in governance of large companies. One is agency cost, which you know something about, and the other is coordination. Right, that even if you had no agency cost, but everyone's running around haphazard, the value of a firm is going to be really low. So I'm not quite there yet. So to the extent that one kind of worries about the unpredictability or certain types of pathologies of retail voting, where some people are becoming informed, some people are basically voting to virtue signal, others are you're basically tossing a coin. The coordination part may actually get worse. Could that have actually catalyzed this growth of controllers and basically say, look, we're going to exercise greater coordination, possibly at the cost of increased agency cost, and how would you weigh those things?
Yeah, we have heard, I'm sure that you guys will put it forward in a much more coherent way, but you've heard those arguments that the fact that we have more activism, corporate governance more developed, this has led to more private equity and to controlled companies. And people keep saying, because you have shareholder voting, because you have plaintiff lawyers, CEOs are going private and they're listing and they are retaining dual class when they go public and so forth. And so now everything might have a small effect on the margin, but I think that this is not a first order effect. For one thing, we see those structures, both controlled structures and small minority controllers all over the world, including in countries where they don't have virtue signaling, crazy shareholder proposals, Dodd-Frank compliance requirement, and so forth. And there is good analysis when companies will want to do this. And regardless of why it's happening, given that we have this large number of controlled companies, and especially dual class companies, it's important, regardless of what brought them about, to make sure that controllers do not run them and use them in a way that would be to the detriment both of the economy and public investors.
Great. We've got some time for questions from the audience, but if the panelists want to cross-examine each other, I'm all for it. All right. So I've taught many classes in this classroom, and it's overwhelmingly tempting to cold call on people. And I see to my left Bruce Goldfarb from Okapi Partners. Bruce, thanks for coming. Did you know you're going to get cold called? Have you ever been cold called in this classroom?
The room was not renovated yet.
Okay. So, I mean, so we've been talking obviously a lot about sort of the aggregation of preferences and information. Your day job is very much about like trying to figure out how to both understand that dynamic and in some cases to try to kind of push it in one direction or another. What sorts of things like have surprised you as we've kind of entered into this greater emphasis on stockholder voting and the franchise, and what are some of the challenges that you see?
Well, I don't know that we've entered into a greater emphasis on stockholder voting. We've entered into a greater emphasis on which segment of the stockholders vote and how they vote. And what's most surprising is that the largest concentration of the stockholders try to run from their ability to vote, and that they try to create various formats of differentiating their vote and purport to handing their vote to other people who don't actually want that vote. And part of the reason we have these large stockholders is because there are shareholders who want to invest and not vote. And that voting is an important part of the process. It's how I earn a living, because people do or do not vote. But that's a choice in and of itself. And that what's most unfortunate with the recent regulations of 13D and G is that we're taking the concept of the ideas behind why you think value can be created and inflating that with control of a company. Whereas voting is not necessarily always about control of the company, it's about expressing opinions to get to control.
Interesting. Professor Lund, can I call on you? Oh wait, I'm gonna call on you first, and then raise your hands. So you have done a study on pass-through voting with Lundbrov and Talley, and you know, one of the things that you find is exactly as Jill mentioned. You know, that you're not actually passing through voting. You're passing through designation of, you know, a handful of sort of policies for voting. One of which, you know, at the Vanguard level, which you studied, was whatever Vanguard wants to do, right? That, you know, we're going to pass through the vote to you, Dorothy Lund, and you're going to tell us, I want to vote the way that Vanguard votes. Like, what do the sort of the numbers break down? Has there been a lot of uptake of these pass-through voting? Have they diverged from the default, just whatever Vanguard wants to do?
Well, this was something that was sort of surprising to us in doing this study, because when you hear about pass-through voting, I think the thing that I thought was going to happen is that you were going to see the empowerment of ESG activism. It was going to be these people who were, you know, really into ESG. We're going to have the ability to pull that out and vote in favor of it. And that's actually not what we found. We found that most people are not at this point opting in who are given the choice to opt into voting choice, which is the, you know, technical term for pass-through voting, via these third-party proxy advisors. They're not choosing to do it, and when they do, the vast majority are actually choosing the management-aligned policy, which is actually, you know, very similar to how Vanguard's been voting. Although, you know, I think there are really big questions on the horizon. You know, Scott hit on some. What's the default going to be, right? Because right now, and this is actually a question I'd love to kick back to the panel and hear some thoughts on, is right now the default is with the asset managers, which means this is a really insignificant thing. Most people aren't opting in. Other things have been floated, including mirror voting. You know, I'd love to hear from Lucian, for example. What do you think of this? I mean, he's written a lot about, you know, the large asset managers and his concerns with their incentives to engage in stewardship. You know, what do you make of this question of, you know, they're passing through the votes, and where should the default sit in this pass-through voting world?
Yeah. I mean, I share your concern in a way that if we are concerned, and that's why some of the reforms in this area are taking place, we are concerned with how the big three and other large asset managers have been voting. If we kick back the default to them, we haven't done much. On the other hand, I've been wrestling with this, and mirror voting, or what you propose, passivity, the reason why I'm not completely sure we should go in this direction is that it's hard to draw the line. Everybody who holds this view that we should do mirror voting or passivity would say the big three should definitely be there. But we know from the finance literature that so many of the large mutual funds are closet indexers. So some fidelity funds are, you know, equivalent to 95% of the S&P 500 index with some adjustment on the margin. And the question is, do you include them? Do you have some sort of a quantitative Rubicon? So that's some of the issues that I've wrestled with, and I've not yet concluded.
Let's go up here and then there. So.
Yeah, hi. I would think, given all the regulatory changes and the changes in engagement, it must be a difficult time for investor relations officers. And the gentleman from Elliott talked about how engagement with companies has changed this year. So I just wanted to hear a bit more about that. You know, how's your relationship with investor relations officers this year? Has it changed from last year? And any advice you'd give for them?
Yeah, I mean, we spend, it's a core responsibility of my team, which is a global team. We have a team that spends time both in campaigns and also in the context of just kind of, you know, just the ordinary course, you know, with investors talking about different sectors. I think it's really, I don't believe those meetings will change and go back to the way they were a year ago until, in the absence of some kind of clear written statement from the SEC. I know they've been been making, commentary from the corporate fin staff at different conferences. At Tulane, for example, there were some comments on this issue. But I think written guidance is really important for these large institutions to govern themselves. And so some additional piece of paper is going to be important. I mean, these meetings are quite notable in that basically the kind of feedback we used to get was more directional in terms of, kind of support or not for the overall thesis of our proposals about, a change in strategy or a shift in focus or perhaps even, a change in the board. It's much harder now to get that kind of information, and the company has a much harder time getting it too, which we've heard is a problem.
Can I weigh in from the other side? So I spend a bit of time advising public companies, and the advice that we give to public companies is that you actually need to lean in to more shareholder engagement, not less in this environment. So I think some of the panelists talked earlier about potentially increasing no votes on directors, potential no votes on say on pay. That's a real concern for many public companies, is if you don't have any kind of early warning system of dissent among your shareholders. So this is actually counterintuitively a reason that public companies have to spend more time and get more creative with shareholder engagement. And just to give you one example of creative engagement, that might be going to smaller shareholders who are below the 13 DG threshold and talking to them. And they might actually be thrilled to talk to management because they usually don't get the same level of attention that the bigger shareholders get.
Just a small footnote to this. You are right, but I think that there are two factors that might work in the opposite direction. One is companies have for some time been concerned about no votes for directors or no votes on say on pay. But that was given an institutional environment in which the number of no votes meant a great deal because proxy advisors then would have this kind of data recommendation, or because institutional investors, as a result of that, would vote more negatively. If the environment is changing so that proxy advisors become less influential and institutions become less critical, the significance of the no votes would recede. If you look at the data, before ISS had the policy that if you don't follow a majority of the shareholders in a vote, companies where annual elections passed by a significant majority did not follow it and kept staggered vote in the charter. When ISS had this change in the policy, things have changed. And then the other thing, maybe I'll add as a footnote to Scott, I think the potentially worrisome for activism and or anyone who thinks that we should address agency problem is not just how much investors are talking with activists. Obviously, it's always frustrating if you come and people don't want to talk with you. But whether the marginal inclination to vote with activists or against the company is going to change in the new environment. And from my writing, I think there is a danger that this might change. I hope not, but that this might change in the years to come.
Just to add just a small point on that, which there tends to be a focus on activism as the kind of the test for this type of engagement. I actually think it's also active shareholders play a very important role in the kind of ordinary course conversations that they have with investors. And so while it's kind of easy to focus on the proxy fight as sort of the ultimate expression of this, those touch points that go on all the time, which are largely invisible, are really what drive accountability of public companies in large part.
All right, we have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Stephanie Wheeler, and I'm a graduate of Columbia Business School, and I walked in the halls of Uris Hall, so that sort of ages me. And I'm also a CPA. Now, not a practicing CPA, but indeed I have both. And believe it or not, some of my best classes were the law classes, because everything is interrelated.
a lot of things.
And we're talking here about the proxies, and I'd like to understand a little bit of how you let the ones who are releasing the proxies have the communication in a more readable form. I always read the footnotes, but then again, I have a different understanding. But one of the issues that we see now in the news with the retail investors and having bought into these funds where they didn't know what the hell was going on. Now, how would you address that so that others of different levels of education, of money and whatnot, the Robin Hood, so to speak, can make it into this world? And I still believe that the New York Stock Exchange, which is owned by ICE, not the ICE, but the International Exchange, is the best, absolutely best capital in the world.
Honest to God, you had me when you said your best classes were at Columbia Law School. So from there, I was completely sold. One of the things I will tell you, and we are basically out of time, and it's a large raft of questions. But one of the things that has been actually at the core of a lot of recent research is the digestibility and readability of mandatory disclosures. This is something that Jeff and Dorothy, I think, kind of have to contend with a little bit in their own work on if private equity is going to be making disclosures. How much do you read it? Like, I'm going to guess that you are in a very small minority of folks, other than business school professors, who comb through the notes to financial statements in a 10K. And then when you've got a 10Q as well, that's going to put a larger reading cost on people. Now, the hope, I guess the theory, is that there are enough arbitrageurs out there who are meticulously reading these disclosures, that will create some price protection, but there's no guarantee they're going to have preferences the same as yours, or portfolio considerations or tax positions the same as yours as well. And, in some ways, I would say the first panel today kind of like, almost sort of suggested this same set of conundrums of, where can disclosure help solve things, and where might it sort of, overwhelm people with a pipeline of information. So I've got to close the conference. Yeah.
I was just saying thank you.
Oh, yeah, sure, thank you. I want to thank everyone for sticking it out through the afternoon. This has been a super interesting and helpful set of sessions today. I want to, in particular, thank our staffers at the Millstein Center, including Molly Calkins and Erica Mitnick-Klein, who have done an amazing job in putting the panel together. I also want to give a complete shout out not just to these panelists, but all of the panelists who have been up during the day. It's what makes a conference and an intellectual engagement, and not just sort of whatever we spend our time doing. So thank you very much. Stay tuned. We will be, the Millstein Center hosts several conferences during the year. We've got others that are coming up, and so you should expect to hear from us. And thanks again for coming.